Many of us were hopeful that this morning at 11 we would hear from Oslo that the Arab Spring in some form or fashion, through an Egyptian, through a Tunisian, through someone in house arrest in London, would be put in the spotlight by the Nobel jury. The impact of Facebook, Twitter, social networks in general has been chronicled again and again in the past few months, especially. What we're seeing is the good side. What we hear about is the good side of the impact. I'm curious to know, Alec, where you have had to deal with the bad side of these of this increased connectivity.
Sure. Well, first let me say what a pleasure it is to be here to help close off this session of HUBFORUM. I have enormous amount of respect for my friend Vincent Ducret, and all the more for his very impressive assembly of executives and entrepreneurs here today. A couple things. So first, in terms of the Nobel Peace Prize, I actually think that the three women who were awarded it are obviously very deserving of it. And, you know, when you think about the Nobel Peace Prize, more often than not, you think about a person or a few people. And I think that in the case of the Arab Spring, part of what is true, part of what we've learned is that there isn't one person who you can say is the big revolutionary leader. There's nobody's face who we're going to put on a t-shirt and say, this is the person who we all follow in the Arab Spring. Rather, it is truly citizen-centered. In South Africa, with the change from apartheid to black rule, you had Nelson Mandela. In Europe, at the transition of the Cold War, there was Lech Walesa, there was Václav Havel, and people like this. But what's interesting about the Arab Spring is even though there are leaders, it's very distributed. And anybody sitting in the room could be a leader of the Arab Spring because they are participating and they are leading in part because of the power given to them by these social networks. Now, I do think it's important to be sort of non-utopian about these networks. I think that they've been incredibly powerful. I think they've facilitated leaderless movements. I think that they've made the movement building much faster, fast. I think that it has enriched the information environments in these countries. So people where before dictators could have managed the information that people got. Today, you cannot keep information away from people. If you try, it's like you're swimming against the tide. But as this power goes from dictators to citizens, the dictators are going to fight it. And so a lot of what we see right now is governments playing a very malignant, almost evil role in terms of how they would seek to infiltrate, monitor, and manipulate the content that's on the internet. And so now a lot of my work is very focused on helping people stay safe when they do use these networks. Because if you're in Syria right now and the al-Assad government finds out who you are, they're going to arrest you, they're going to torture you, and you're going to spend a lot of time in jail. So even though Ben Ali was caught by surprise in Tunisia and Mubarak was caught by surprise in Egypt, none of these other rulers where revolutions are going to take place in the future, none of them are ever going to be surprised again. And so they're all going to have their eyes on social media.
Thank you. You, State Department, finance some special project for digital diplomacy. One of them is called Commotion. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. So it's interesting. There was an old ambassador to France. America's second ambassador to France, I think, was Thomas Jefferson. And he was our first Secretary of State. And one thing he said was, the only legitimate foundation for government is the will of its people. And to preserve its free expression should be our first order. So Hillary Clinton, my boss, is our 67th Secretary of State. But that value, respecting free expression, respecting free press and such things. If you are going to respect those things in the year 2011, you've got to promote it on the internet. And so what we've done is this year we've spent about $30 million supporting about a dozen projects where diplomats are giving, we've given about $30 million to, 12 different geek projects where they can develop tools to help people be able to stay connected to the internet and be safe on the internet and be safe on these networks. So 2 examples. One is Commotion, which is also known as the internet in a suitcase, which means that if you're in a country and people try to turn the internet off, this gives you a way of building your own ad hoc network. Another example is something that we supported financially called a panic button. Because a lot of the time what we've seen is when activists have been getting arrested lately, the police will take their mobile phone and they'll look at the SMSs they've sent, they'll look at their address book, and by looking in the address book of the activist, they will know what the activist networks are. So this panic button sends an alert that the activist is being arrested, and it also wipes their communications and their contacts. So these are 2 of about 12 examples of what we've supported.
Beyond the Arab world, many other dictatorships are looking at what's happening there and waiting to see whether there will be a wave that will reach them. How are you looking at the future in terms of what other countries, what other parts of the world might be concerned?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So more often than not, when we help develop tools, it's not, one country by one country by one country. It's important to me to avoid hypocrisy. So a program like Commotion isn't developed just for Syria or just for one other country. It can be used anywhere. And so there are 195 countries on planet Earth. If what we're doing is with integrity, we've got one policy for 195 countries. And when you develop something like a panic button for your mobile phone, it doesn't matter if you are in Tunisia or Syria or France, you should still be able to use that technology. What I do think is that it's very interesting in terms of the trend of youth activism. Obviously, this has been most pronounced recently in countries in the Middle East and North Africa that have dictators. However, I do think that we are seeing activism manifest itself much more strongly everywhere. I mean, look at the London riots. Look at the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States. Now, I don't think you can conflate. I don't think you can say it's all the same thing, but what I do believe is that there is a level of disconnectedness between young people, and I'm 39, so when I say young, I mean under 40. And when I turn 40 next month, young is going to mean 40 and under. And the year after that, anyway. So I do think that there's a disconnectedness oftentimes between the governing and the governed. And this isn't just in the Middle East. And I think that governments around the world are going to have to think about how to contend with their citizens, newly empowered with devices which give them more voice, and they need to think about how they connect and engage with them in a productive way, because we're getting into an environment that is increasingly disruptive.
I think what we're seeing is empowerment all over the world. One of the issues that this points to is when is the threshold reached where you have too much empowerment? What I mean by that is, I remember reading an article about the first time that the White House asked people to express what they would like, legislations or which issues they wanted to see confronted. And I remember that the number one issue was legalization of marijuana. So we went from not enough information about what people wanted to perhaps too much information about what people wanted. How do you deal with that transition?
Yeah, I think that's a good problem. I mean, I don't believe in the premise that citizens can have too much power. I think that citizens ought to have the power. And so, like the legalized marijuana thing, I think actually proved an important point. There was a community of people who were in favor of legalizing marijuana, and what they did is they organized themselves. They said, hey, the White House is going to do this polling. Let's all organize ourselves. So rather than saying, oh, well, that didn't work, like, we asked the public for their opinion. They gave us their opinion. Obviously, they're stupid. I take the opposite view of that. I take the view of give some credit to the people who knew how to organize.
The pot smokers.
In this case, yeah. So the lesson that I take away from that is if the White House, if the Élysée, if number 10 Downing Street, if governments are going to open themselves up, then the onus is on the citizens to organize themselves. And those who don't organize, their issues will not be heard. And those who do organize themselves, like in this case the legalizing marijuana campaign, we're talking about it in a stage in Paris now. So they deserve the credit for organizing.
True that.
You've been in Syria a few months ago. What was your feeling being there,
Yeah, so it was a little over a year ago. And I think that what is happening in Syria right now reflects the malignance of the al-Assad government. I had a remarkable... So the al-Assad government is like something out of a bad movie. The degree to which they spy on and torture their people. And when I was there, I was meeting with the highest government officials of Syria. But I was also meeting with these young people, these young entrepreneurs. And what I was struck by was it was like it's not only were they like from different countries, it's like they were from different planets. And I was struck, there was one time where all of these government ministers got together and they were going to make the presentation to these Americans. And there was a young woman who came in and, with the kafia, face covered, and she was working in this incubator. And I asked her a question, and I said, if you had one piece of advice for government, what would it be? And I thought she was going to give me the advice. And she turned to the government minister, and she goes, stop censoring the internet. And she goes, stop censoring Google so that we can get access to information. If you want job growth in Syria, stop telling the people what information they can and can't get. And so I thought it was remarkable, the courage of this young woman who is probably 19 or 20 years old, confronting this old minister in front of the Americans. And what I hope is that after we left, she didn't get arrested. I think she probably did. And so the thing that I was struck by was just the degree to which the Syrian people and the Syrian dictatorship were in two totally and completely different places. And what I hope is that Bashar al-Assad ends up in the same place that the other leaders have ended up in lately who have been on the wrong side of history.
There's a conversation I caught on Twitter the other day. I know that you're friends with Ashton Kutcher, who has more followers on Twitter.
He has more than me, that's for sure.
He has more than you, but he also has more than President Barack Obama, which I find more surprising still, Alec. I caught a conversation between him, Mia Farrow was involved as well, and a couple of Syrian opposition members, protesters, bloggers, activists. What, in recent times, what is the most interesting conversation that you've been involved in via Twitter from perhaps someone out of the blue calling you upon landing, for instance, in Syria or some other place?
Yeah, for me, Twitter is less about talking than listening. I think people who view social media as just a new broadcast medium, a way of getting your message out, I don't think they entirely understand social media. For me, I try to remember that I've only got one mouth, but I've got two ears. And so for me, Twitter is more about listening than talking. Now, to the extent that I've engaged in dialogues online, what has been most interesting lately? It more often than not has had to do with myth breaking. So one thing that I think is proving true right now is people are afraid of social media being a place where rumors can take root. And what I believe is happening right now is that so many people are using social media that it's actually a place where rumors get broken quickly. And so it's interesting. So the conversations I've been getting in lately have been, if somebody says something that's just factually inaccurate, I'll put facts out there and then watch sort of the community discuss it and take it to a resolution.
Okay, we talked about conversations. I want to talk about fights. There was, on September 14th, Salman Rushdie decided to open a Twitter account. And soon thereafter, Taslima Nasreen noticed that he had started his account and started a huge argument with him. It turned into, it was it got pretty serious pretty soon. And I don't know what the count is today, but Salman had 50,000 followers in 3 days. Picking fights on Twitter is one of the tools to get followers and to sort of increase your networks. What is the most significant argument that you've gotten in recent times?
Yeah, I avoid fights on Twitter and Facebook. They tend not to be very productive. And there are enough people out there that don't like me. I don't need to create more opportunities for them. The only time, I don't know that I've gotten in a fight on Twitter. Certainly lots of people have hurled insults at me. It's funny, during the last session I was checking my Twitter feed, and there's always somebody who's saying they're going to overthrow the government, somebody who tells me what a jerk I am or something like that. And in my case, it's just better not to respond to it. Now, if there are legitimate arguments or legitimate points of view that people want to share, then I'm happy to discuss it. But I think that doing so in sort of 140 characters tends to be just messy. I remember there was a Twitter conversation between the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, and a British journalist named Ian Burrell. And I actually thought that even though I actually thought that President Kagame didn't come out of that looking very good, in part because he's a president and he's debating a journalist over this very short-form medium that is Twitter. So I don't know that fighting on social media tends to be overly productive.
Fair enough.
As a closing remark, last year we came at HUBFORUM discussing about from e-campaign to e-diplomacy. This year the topic is from e-revolution to e-society. How could you define e-society, which might be the topics of next year for all those countries?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to see the degree to which social media has been used for the purposes of exercising dissent. And I think that that's been very positive. But what's going to be more difficult is how do you go from dissent, breaking somebody or something down? How do you go from that to building something? So if you think about the internet, historically the internet is better for amplifying voices at the edges than the moderate voices. The internet historically has not been a good place for compromise. It's been a place to, push out a strong message. And so what I'm worried about, frankly, and what I think is going to be really, really hard, and where I'm not that optimistic, is in using these tools in places where they were very effective bringing down a government, seeing how they can be productively used for the purposes of elections and governance. I think it's going to be very hard. But the I think the United States needs some humility in this respect. It's not like we have the answers to this. In the United States, the internet is no different. It's not a place that's been good for compromise. On the left, we've got the Netroots. On the right, we've got the Tea Party. And both of them have been the most effective users of the internet and social media in a political context. So if there are people who are able to innovate and use these networks, use these tools as ways of forging compromise, of building a productive e-society as you discuss it, and as you will be engaging on it next year, then this would be very, very good for society. And all the better if leadership on this comes from countries like France. Because I think oftentimes, we need more countries assuming the mantle of leadership on these things. And the United States right now has nothing to brag about in terms of creating productive political spaces. I think, it's a good time to be working in foreign policy for me and not to be working on American politics. So hopefully, over the course of the next year, France can help show us the way in terms of how the internet can be used to build a healthy e-society. Thank you.
Inshallah. Just one last question. You talked about the fact that you were concentrating on foreign policy and not on American politics. Are you going to be working at all in the coming year on American politics?
Yeah, no, a presidential campaign is the most fun you don't want to have twice. So my plan is not to go back to the re-elect. There'll be lots of people involved, and I've been in a bubble for the last 2.5 years, and we actually, if the Obama campaign is going to equal or exceed what it did in 2008, it's going to be because people who have stayed a little closer to the innovation and have not been wearing pinstripe suits and doing diplomacy. And it's better for the young innovators to be working on the 2012 campaign.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alec.
Voilà, merci à tous.